Hi, everybody. Here I am, Nicki Edgell, talking to you today after a couple of days of break from these daily lives. I hope you've all had a good couple of days, and it's been quite turbulent times energetically. We've had a full moon eclipse, and as I explained in my last video, we were entering an eclipse season, as it were. So these sort of peak energy moments can have a really strong effect. They have a really strong effect on the tides. We've just had a very, very strong spring, I guess it's summer tide, coming up to the solstice now as we are. And I was just down on the beach this morning, and the tide was really, really low. I mean, it was like being abroad, actually walking on sand. And I come from Brighton, so we don't see a lot of sand unless it's really low tide. So yeah, this is affecting the oceans, but it also affects the cells in our body. After all, we are 70 to 80% water, so there's a massive pull on our cells, and at this time we can feel emotional intensity, we can feel physical symptoms magnifying, and these are the times when we need to really listen and take some time out to be quiet, to be still, to connect with nature. That's the best medicine, and a bit of laughter and so forth. And that's basically what I've been doing the last few days. So today I'd love to talk to you about psychoneuroimmunology. It's a bit of a mouthful. It's taken me a while to learn how to say it without stumbling over the words. It's a clinical practice that came out of some studies that happened back in the 80s in America, when a whole load of scientists got together from different departments, the neurological department, the immunological departments, the psychological departments, all the different departments, endocrinologists, all the different ologists, if you like, got together, and they said, there must be something in common that we all have, and they worked out how their pathways that they were all independently looking at, how they all interrelated to one another, interreacted with one another, and how, if you think about it, makes so much sense. We're not just an arm or a head or a leg or a liver organ or a heart organ. Everything is connected. And out of that came the science of psychoneuroimmunology. I guess they couldn't put too many other ologies on, otherwise it would be even a longer word, but it does include much more than neurology, which is the nervous system, psychology, which is the mind, the immunology, which is the immune system. Those are the three words in the title, but it also includes, as I mentioned, endocrinology, which is the hormonal system, our anthropological roots, how we've evolved as human beings, how our systems have evolved, how our genes have evolved, and what it really means to be human, I guess, is how I look on it. So it takes into account all sorts of things and how they react with one another. Everything is connected, as I say. And your current symptoms are a reflection of what has gone before. So they don't ever stand on their own. They're part of a story. They're part of a film, if you like. And we look as clinical psychoneuroimmunologists. So this is the clinical practice of the science that was found. Somebody 25, 30 years ago or more said, well, why don't we make this into a clinical practice? Because it seems such a sensible thing to do, to look at the body as a whole, look at the mind, the body, the spirit, the anthropological roots, look at everything, exercise, food, nutrient deficiencies, trauma, psychological or physical, wherever the stressor comes from is what we as practitioners look for. We're looking to see the root, the cause of the cause of the cause of the cause. So we're like, I sort of always describe myself as a bit of a detective, a health detective. So I'm really asking lots of different questions to see if we can get at the thing that's triggered your current symptoms. Because it's all very well looking at giving you relief from your current symptoms, that approximate approach. But if you don't deal with the cause, then you've got to carry on with that proximate approach forever. And kind of a lot of medicines that we are given, we're told we have to have forever. And that really does stem from the fact that they're just looking at the symptom rather than the root cause. And so clinical psychoneuroimmunology, or PNI, as I like to shorten it down to, it's much easier to say, really looks at proximate interventions as well as optimum interventions. So that's that global looking at the cause. So if we can switch off a stress tap, if you like, then the body doesn't need to respond in a stress response way. So that fight flight can really come into rest as it's intended to. That is part of being human. We have these amazing systems that cause us to survive, but they have their consequences if they're overused. This is a bit like if we eat all the time, well, we're going to be using and asking huge amounts from our pancreas to produce all the digestive enzymes that are needed to break down your food. And there's no time for recovery and repair. Same with exercise. If we do too much exercise or the inappropriate exercise, we can cause more stress in the body, believe it or not. So it's, there's very complex system. And we look at 5 meta models. We have got, and look, I've got this huge pack of cards, which is just a tiny proportion. I just thought I'd show you tiny proportion of my notes from my studies. My postgraduate diploma in clinical psychoneuroimmunology took up I don't know how many books of notes and things that I read. And we have, we're always looking at cutting edge papers that are being published. During our studies, we were learning about things that hadn't yet even been published, that the clinical psychoneuroimmunologists had actually discovered. And in fact, I've just been reading this weekend from my tutor, Leo Primbaum. He's written a paper all about the virology and looking at COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, and looking at the possible epigenetic influences. And this is one of the things we look at with interventions, is that the gene expression isn't a given. It has to have certain circumstances, certain conditions in order for genes to be expressed. So even if we have a gene that could lead to a disease pathway, we can actually supersede it with our environment and the conditions that we put ourselves in to keep that gene switched off so it doesn't have to express itself. And actually, this article is very interesting because he's looking at this gene called the ACE2 gene, that is a surface cell containing angiotensin converting enzyme 2. A lot of things in PNI, I've got very long names, and I write them down because my brain doesn't, I'm a bit dyslexic, so I find I can keep those words in my head. But anyway, this is fascinating, and I may well do a whole talk all about this paper on its own, and what it's suggesting about we might have some epi drugs, epigenetic things, very natural and easy to use things that can actually have an effect on this ACE2 gene, and so that it doesn't express itself, and so we don't have this cytokine storm, this intensity of the symptoms, or even the susceptibility to the virus expressing itself. So these are the types of things that I look at as a clinical psychoneuroimmunologist. These 5 meta models are really important. They are sort of behind the questioning. So we're looking at specifically, how does your problem affect you on 5 different levels? What's the text and the context of it? What's the film? How do you methylate? What's your energy distribution? Are you hyper? Or have you got disposed of organs? We look at so many things that then, with all that information, we then make some recommendations, some suggestions of interventions to bring about balance to those disturbed pathways. And one of the key things for working with people is to use what we call deep learning. So we actually do explain these very complex pathways to you. And the premise of that is that we're speaking to the subconscious, and the brain is really looking for a resolution. It's looking for a solution to why it is there's a stress going on in the body. So when we can explain that, the brain says, oh, thank you very much. I have my answer. I don't need to keep this stressor going anymore. So it's a wonderful practice. I love it because it does include the nutritional therapy training that I had, which was very much a naturopathic approach, looking at the film as well, rather than the current symptoms, and looking at everything that may have led to the current symptoms. And then layered upon that, we've got that deep learning, the hard science, and then the soft skills that are the interventions. So they can be anything from tweaking your food choices, making sure you've got certain nutrient content, maybe through supplementation, using herbs and spices as wonderful tools to bring about resolution to stress. And we use a word called resiliomics, which is how we can affect a switch off of the inflammatory process that is caused through the stress trigger, the fight-flight trigger, so that the body can complete a wound healing. And wounds don't necessarily mean something that you've had inflicted an injury on the surface of your skin or internally through an accident. It can be psychological wounds as well. So yeah, it's just fascinating. I absolutely love it. And we look at mechanisms of action. So we're looking at those different pathways, and we're looking at what mechanisms of action are required, and therefore what nutrients, what interventions, whether it be some supplementation, and also a regime for certain types of exercise, and specifically when those exercises may be plugged into your day, looking at whether or not certain types of fasting might be useful, intermittent fasting, whether we look at whether pain, for example. Some people come to see me because they've got chronic pain, and we look at how the mechanisms work with that. Could be that you've got insulin resistance going on, and therefore some weight gain, and your hormones are out of balance. Could be to do with bones or lungs. You might be suffering with a diagnosis of osteopenia or osteoporosis, or any of those labels. But I don't work with labels because we're looking at the whole. So we're looking to work to bring balance to the whole. And what's lovely is that some of those labels just, you know, fall away. And certainly in my case, that has been very true. I used to have eczema, asthma. I used to have back pain, all sorts of things that were, you know, supposedly I was probably going to have them for life, and maybe they'd get worse and I'd need some medications. But once I'd started upon this route of my own healing 20 years ago, those labels just sort of fell away. It's not to say that they don't come back in different guises. Sometimes we have stresses coming at us all the time, and sometimes we can't deal with absolutely everything all at once. So it's a process, and as you age, you maybe are ready to look at something else, or something else happens and that triggers a stress response that can bring about physical symptoms that you've had in the past, for example. So sometimes if I, you know, over Christmas I had a chest infection and a lung and a throat infection. Well, as a child, I used to get a lot of this sort of thing, but I haven't for many years. I do suspect that it was the virus that I had, and perhaps I was one of the early adopters of that. But I use my tools to get myself through it, and that's the beauty of this practice, psychoneuroimmunology, is that there's not a one size fits all. It's a very individual approach, and that's why I work one-to-one with people, and we really get to understand what is needed, and a lot of psychosocial interventions I use, because in my view there is always a P in the PNI. It's just, you know, it's part of it, or it can be an absent part, if you like, of that meta model, but that means that it's there in some ways. So we often live our future from our past, don't we? We bring our past into our future, and it affects our present as well. So I hope that's given you a little bit of an insight into the clinical practice that I use. And if you're at all interested and you'd like to get in touch, I'll put my details in the comments below. Just private message me, email me, or phone me if you like, and we can have a chat about whether this would be something that could be useful for you, or if you think there's other people that might benefit from that. Please do pass on my details. So I shall see you for another live. I really hope that you're weathering the change in weather, and also the energies, and just allow yourself plenty of time and get yourself into nature. That it really does help to bring you back to yourself and to your center. So I'll say goodbye for now.